For instance, if you run a restaurant and somebody slips and falls at the front door of your business may, like, potentially, depending on the situation, might have some liability for that. But you, as the person who owns the business, typically would not bear any liability, provided that you have an entity to shield you from that. If you don't have an LLC or a corporation or a partnership in place, you as an individual might be on the hook for any damages associated with that slip and fall. If there's a breach of contract, if you've got customers that are disgruntled, all these things can possibly lead to lawsuits. And you as an individual want to make sure you're protected so that there's a shield between you and the business. Another key aspect to business formation is sharing ownership of especially intellectual property. If you are working by yourself, it's relatively easy to manage who's going to own the IP because it's just you. If you've got a business partner, maybe 2 or 3 people, you've got someone who's working part-time on this idea, it suddenly gets much more complicated as to who should own whatever IP you guys are generating. If you're creating an app, you're going to have artwork, you're going to have code, you're going to have all kinds of different little pieces that are going to come together to make the business work. You will want, ideally, the business to own all of that IP, whatever the company is. Potentially, depending on how people work, maybe you have certain license arrangements with some of the service providers, but typically you form an entity so that all of that can be owned together in one place, and you're not relying on a bunch of ad hoc kind of handshake agreements to run the business. Because at some point down the road, if you're looking for funding or if you're looking to make an exit, whoever's going to be giving money to the company is going to want to know that key assets like IP are actually owned by this business that they're buying, as opposed to 7 or 8 different individuals. As your business starts to grow and turn over revenue, you're going to want whatever that revenue, the value, to be held by the company. Just from a general standpoint, it's an easier way to manage money if the company owns it and then the company is paying salaries. It's a better way to make sure everybody is on the same page about who should be getting paid. If you're signing contracts with customers, with vendors, with other service providers, this kind of redounds back to incurring liability. You want to be signing in the name of the company so that they know they're dealing with this entity. If they're going to sue anybody, it should be the business, not you as an individual. And last, but certainly not least, as you enter a growth stage with the business, you're going to you will likely want or need to raise money to accelerate the growth of the business. It is hard to nearly impossible to do that without a legally well-founded entity that investors will invest in. People will want to give money, but in exchange, they're going to want a piece of whatever your business is, whether they're going to want debt or they're going to want some ownership piece of it. You can't do that with just individuals. You need an entity to make it work. Sometimes you can get money from friends and family before that stage, but that's pretty early going. And the kind of money you'll want as you really start to grow the business will likely come from more established investors that are going to want to see an entity in place. Will need to see an entity in place.
And Spenser, Omar had a question that I think feeds into that, and he says, "How does business entities select impact venture capital investments?" So entity, I think you might be getting into that in the next slide, but Omar had that question.
That's right. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But from a very, very high standpoint, most VC firms prefer to invest in corporations because it's the kind of entity they're more comfortable with. So Kate, can you go to the next slide, please? So this is a bit about that, and we'll get into it in more detail. There's a variety of different types of entities, and you could, in theory, form your business in any state in the United States, you could technically, I suppose, form a foreign company as well. Typically, if you're a Temple student and you're living in Pennsylvania, there are probably two options you'd want to go for. Delaware is the most common in my experience for a variety of reasons. You also see a few companies form Pennsylvania entities as well. Usually that's for businesses that they're less likely to take on investment. Maybe it's an operating company and they just want to build the business in kind of an old-fashioned, slower growth way. Delaware is more common for entities that are anticipating investment in the future. So common types of entities, there's really two main types of entities you'll see a lot. C corporations, that's corporations that are taxed under subchapter C of the IRS code. This is kind of the default for corporate taxation. And then limited liability companies, those are the two main ones. You'll see S corps occasionally. They're much less common. In my experience, S corps tend to be businesses that, again, you're a small group of people, you're kind of just growing it with this group of people. You're probably less likely to take on significant amounts of investors. And there are specific rules about having S corps that, if that's a path you're considering, you'd want to walk down with a tax advisor on that standpoint. We can go ahead and go to the next one. Thanks, Kate. So C corps, again, this is what I work with most often. I find them to be easy to get started and very amenable to investment down the road. The key upside is that they're highly flexible types of entities. There's no restrictions on stockholders, and either the number of type you can have, like most public companies are C corporations. So they have, hundreds, thousands, millions of stockholders. They're individuals, they're businesses, they're foreign, they're domestic. There's all kinds of potential owners. The ownership structure can also be very, very flexible. You can have lots of different classes of debt, lots of different classes of equity with all kinds of different benefits to each one. So there's a lot you can do with a corporation if it's the right choice for you. Last but certainly not least, as you move down the road and you're looking at getting VC money or some other kind of funding, investors typically like to do C corporations because they're more comfortable with them. The biggest downside to a C corporation is that and this is less of an issue early stage, but as you start to generate revenue, you'll hit a double taxation issue. You've probably heard of this at some point, but as the corporation makes money, it first is taxed at the corporate level, then that money is distributed out to shareholders, and then the shareholders pay a tax on that eventually as well. So if you're a shareholder and you are not an employee of the company, you're not making a salary, the company, let's say it's 20% at the corporate rate and then another 20% in the individual rate. You've got $1, you lose 20% as a corporation. You've got 80 cents left, that goes out to stockholders. Stockholders pay another 20%. That ends up with, I think, 64 cents on the dollar. So not ideal, especially compared to LLCs, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Early stage, you're probably not yielding a high amount of return for yourself or your investors, so that's not as big of a concern early on. One other downside is that corporations have more formalities to the way that they're run. For better or worse, you'll have a little bit more haggling with lawyers to get technical consents and resolutions and things like that, board meetings and minutes and stuff like that, which are not a huge hurdle in any way, but they just take a little bit of time. If you're forming a C Corp, there's really two documents you absolutely have to get in place. You file a certificate of incorporation with whichever state you're going to form. That's the legal benchmark. Once that's filed, your corporation exists. You're also going to want to have bylaws in place to manage, how the organization is run. Who are your officers? What are their powers? What can the board do? What can't the board do? What do stockholders have the power to do? Stuff like that. And then corporations are owned by stockholders or shareholders. The sole power of stock and shareholders, unless there's something in the certificate of incorporation or the bylaws that says otherwise, typically all they do is appoint the board of directors. The board of directors meets regularly, once a month, twice a month, more often, especially for early stage businesses. And their key job, besides kind of general oversight and adopting policies, is to select and then kind of manage officers. Those are going to be CEOs, CFOs, those people. And officers will run the business on the day-to-day. I see there's a couple of questions, so let me just look over here really quickly.
Yeah, thank you. One of them is the issue of sole proprietorship, the pros and cons of sole proprietorship versus LLCs. And then the second question is, what's the impact of converting from an LLC early on to a C Corp for investment?
Sure. So on sole proprietorships, briefly, we don't typically advise operating as a sole proprietorship once you start to run the risk of incurring liability. I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but one of the really key benefits to an entity is that it shields you as an individual from liability that the business might incur. If you're operating as a sole proprietor, that shield doesn't really exist. So if the business gets sued, you as an individual with any savings or assets you have might be on the hook for the business. And those, I mean, a slip and fall can end up with an extremely high bill because medical costs can be so high. So little things that seem like they shouldn't be so devastating can be absolutely, absolutely devastating for businesses. And especially, if you're a young entrepreneur, it's really challenging. And if you have an EIN for your sole proprietorship, you can always form an LLC and then get a new EIN for that, presuming you haven't done a whole lot of operation with the EIN. So that's an easy out for that. If you're converting from an LLC early on to a C Corp, you can do that. And we see some companies form as an LLC and then convert over to a C Corp. I'm not a tax expert, but my understanding generally is that when you make that conversion, you lose some of the tax losses that you would normally be able to carry forward from year to year. And obviously it's not a great tax choice, but if it's the way that you're going to get VC money, then that's the way it works. And there are VC investors that are comfortable investing in LLCs. It just depends on who's putting money in. So Kate, we can go ahead and switch to the next one. I'm just going to very briefly talk about S corporations. These are corporations that are taxed under subchapter S of the IRS, the tax code. The main upside to S corporations is that you benefit from a single layer of taxation, unlike a C corporation where you have the corporate level and then the individual level. It's just taxed at the individual level, so you have a benefit in that there will be less taxes paid. Downsides that there are only certain types of stockholders, so it can really limit the types of investors in your corporation. There's a maximum number of stockholders, so like literally it limits the number of people and the number of ways the company can be owned. You can only have a single class of ownership, which can be problematic, especially as rounds go on. If you have 2 or 3 investment rounds, people are going to want different rights, and it's hard to do that with only a single ownership class. Investors don't typically like S corporations. I don't think I've ever seen a round where people invested in an S. It's possible, I suppose, but it's not something I've seen. And S corporations have even more formalities than a C corporation because there's additional steps associated with maintaining that S status. And in terms of how they're run and the ownership, it's largely the same as C corporations. One additional wrinkle is that you're going to have to make an IRS election, and you'll have to be more attuned to the IRS pieces of how the business is run because it's a special status for the business. So we can go ahead, Kate. Thank you. So the second most common and better for sole proprietors, businesses not seeking investment, that kind of thing. These are limited liability companies. Similar to corporations, to C corporations, there's no restriction on the number of members or the type of members that you can have in your LLC. You can have as many people or as many entities as you want invest. There's also a highly, highly flexible ownership structure. You can give people all kinds of rights and all kinds of voting abilities and all kinds of things like that. The key benefit, like S corporations, LLCs only have a single layer of taxation. So on your $1, if there's no tax at the business level, it's passed directly to you as an owner. So instead of the 20% of the corporate level, 20% at the individual level, it's just the 20% at the individual level, which can yield better take home. LLCs also have fewer formalities. It's much more an entity that exists because you and or additional people have decided it should exist. You sign an operating agreement and that governs the terms of it. There's very few things that are required to be in that agreement. So there's lots of room for you or your partners to make it work the way you want it to. The biggest downside to LLCs is that investors don't like investing in them as much as they like investing in C Corps. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. You can convert from an LLC to a C Corp at the point where you are taking on investment, but there's a tax loss in that your losses can no longer be carried forward from the point of the transfer, the conversion. Similar to C Corps, there's a kind of standard set of organizational documents. You file a certificate of formation with whichever state you want to form, and then you'll work out an operating agreement with your partners that governs how the business is going to be run, who's going to be in charge, who has the power to appoint new managers, those kinds of issues. How tax issues are handled, that's often a big piece of operating agreements. LLCs are typically owned by the individuals who own them are called members. There's two standard management structures for LLCs. They're either member managed, where the owners themselves directly control the business, or they're manager managed, where the owners appoint individuals to run the business itself. And the structure of how LLCs are run, again, it can be highly flexible based on the operating agreement. You see all the time a manager managed LLC that also appoints a CEO and a CFO and other officers to kind of run the day-to-day in a manner very similar to a C corporation. Okay, we can move on. A key thing to think about is the costs of forming an entity, and then there are annual maintenance costs. We're pretty sensitive to this at the firm. I know we have reasonable legal fees for startups because we want to make sure that whatever, if you have a small pool of money when you're first getting started, we would rather you grow that pool of money and continue coming back to us for other services, as opposed to charging you a bunch of money to get your business formed, and then you don't have any money for the business to grow. So it's not really a good idea. So at the firm, we're sensitive to those costs. There are certain fees that we really don't have anything we don't have no control over how they run. So if you're filing to form an entity in Delaware, typically it's going to run you a bare minimum of about $90 just for the filing fee in Delaware, not including legal or other services. Often you'll want to expedite the service so you can get evidence that it exists in a timely manner. If you don't expedite, it can take 2 or more weeks, especially now, given the ongoing, COVID issues with every state office. Delaware is better about turning things around promptly, but it is still an issue to consider. The Delaware costs just to file are about $90. As you expedite, it's going to cost you around $550. If you don't have an office in Delaware, you're going to have to set up what's called a registered agent, which is basically a service that will accept mail for you in Delaware. It's a legal requirement, but it's something you'll have to pay a couple $100s on a yearly basis for. I see there's a question about New Jersey. I don't off the top of my head know the costs for New Jersey. They are probably about the same as the Delaware and Pennsylvania. This price range is about what you're going to look at regardless of where you form. So you can see Pennsylvania is a little bit more expensive. Pennsylvania is not quite as streamlined as Delaware because it's less common for businesses to form here. But again, expediting services will increase costs. Another slightly later stage concern is qualifying your entity to do business. If you form a Delaware C corporation, but the business itself operates in Pennsylvania or Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, states other than Delaware, you may have to do a corporate qualification to do business. This is not something you probably need to think about in your first setup days. As you start opening offices and, if you've got a bunch of employees, you're making a product and selling it in a state, those are some kind of benchmarks where you want to start thinking about whether or not you should qualify to do business. If you don't qualify to do business from a corporate standpoint, then the repercussions are not extremely harsh. The main issue is that you cannot file a lawsuit in state courts of wherever you should be qualified to do business. You can always qualify to do business later and then file suit. So there's workarounds if you don't do it on the exact date at which the law says you have to. It's not hasn't been a huge issue for anything I've worked with. And that's, thank you, Kate. So there are also ongoing fees associated with owning a business. In Delaware, you have franchise taxes. These will vary as the business grows, but initially, $300 or $400. They're not enormous. If you are qualifying to do business, every state will have some kind of a small fee of a few $100s usually, where your business is required to pay that to maintain good standing in whatever that state is. Additionally, you're going to need a registered agent everywhere you don't have a physical address to receive mail. And this is a service. There's lots of providers that will serve as a mail drop box for you with a reasonable cost. Lastly, there are legal fees associated with forming your business. These can vary depending on a variety of factors. Typically, when we form a new entity, it runs between $1,000 and $2,500. If it's simple, you're an individual and you're forming it, you don't have a whole lot of bells and whistles you want, it's going to be on the lower end. The more people are involved and the more complicated the kind of ownership and management structure gets, the more you want to customize things, essentially, the more it's going to cost because you have to spend more time on it. But that's kind of a ballpark figure. These numbers are all subject to change. I think that most states update their costs about every year. Okay, so I've mentioned a couple of times that the key, right, at least from a legal standpoint, and certainly it's very important from a business standpoint, one of the key things about owning a business is that it will limit your liability as an individual from lawsuits. If you and your partners are working together on this business, it's a great idea, but suddenly you're getting sued by, I don't know, Apple because they think that you're infringing on their IP in some way. You certainly don't want to individually be responsible for that. So having an entity is a very, very important and necessary step to shield you from liability. But there are other things you want to keep in mind as you're operating the business so that the shield between you and the company is not stripped away. There's technically a corporate veil between the business and you as an owner of the business. This slide has a bunch of general things to consider as you're working on this, but really, they all really boil down to treating the business as a separate business that's owned by, a different group of people So they have their own interests and their own rights. You want to observe basic formalities. You want to sign things with the business's name. You want to treat the business's money as its own money. If you are an employee for the business, you should be getting a paycheck with a salary. You shouldn't be just taking money out of the business's bank accounts, presuming that it's got money flowing. And you certainly shouldn't be depositing your money into the bank account of the business unless there's some kind of a paper to cover that transaction so that it's clear that your money and the business's money are different. You don't want to commingle those and overlap the funds. The less of a distinction there is between you as an individual and the business, the more likely it is that someone who's suing will be able to go after you as an individual, which is a result we seek to avoid. I see a question. If you set up a nonprofit clinical diagnostic laboratory in, for example, Pakistan, do you have any legal obligations in the US? So if you're setting up a business in a foreign country, the business has no operations in the US, then generally speaking, you probably don't have any US legal obligations. It depends on what exactly you're doing here in the US. Like if you're living in the US and you're earning income, you will have individual tax obligations. That Pakistani-based business might have tax obligations as well. This is a more detailed question than what we're getting into now. Another question from Mario Gutierrez: can LLCs operate internationally? Generally speaking, yes, LLCs and C corporations and S corporations can operate internationally. You're going to, depending on what you're doing, you're going to have to check with the law of wherever you're trying to operate to make sure that the business you're doing is legal in that country and that you don't need some kind of a permit or a pass, something like that, to make sure that works. If you're shipping goods internationally, you're also going to want to make sure that you're complying with customs and other kind of less corporate and more shipping and international trade-based laws. And lastly, can an individual loan money to a nonprofit organization? From a general standpoint, individuals can loan money to nonprofits. Nonprofits, like any other business, are allowed to take out loans and take other reasonable measures to fund themselves. It's a little troubling if you are an owner or an operator or you're an employee of a nonprofit and you're loaning money to the nonprofit. It becomes risky because it starts to feel like you're just using the nonprofit as a funnel to avoid taxes on some of your income. So, or to funnel money that other people donated to you. So it's, generally speaking, it is okay to loan money to nonprofits, but you'd want to be careful about how you're doing it and how those relationships work. Okay, we can move on. Thanks, Kate. A variety of important things to consider as you're forming your new entity. One of the partners that I work with regularly on new businesses thinks of himself in some part as a business divorce lawyer. Co-founder relationships are important when you're forming an entity. If you have 2 or 3 people creating a business, then you're going to want to set out early on how the business will continue to operate if one or more of those people decides that they want to move on and do something else. When we set up new entities, we have a variety of methods to control this. But what you don't want to have is a result where you've got 2 people, they decided together that they were going to create this awesome idea and make a really great business. And then 6 months later, one of them gets a job offer and decides that he'd rather go eat somewhere instead of kind of struggling to build this new thing. You don't want that kind of an action to devastate the relationship between those 2 people, and you don't want it to lead to a situation where someone who's been gone from the company for 6 years, however long, owns half of the company despite having only worked there for 6 months. So those are pieces you're going to want to consider when you're forming a new business. They're not the most fun parts of the conversation, but if you have those conversations up front when everybody's on the same page, it's much easier than having it down the road when somebody's put 6 months, a year of their life into a project, and they're thinking maybe this isn't going to work. They want to walk away, but they also want to get paid or they want to stay involved. So those conversations are best to have up front when you're creating a company. An entity name is important, but not by any means the most important thing. There will be some common law trademark rights you'll get whenever you create an entity and start using the name in the business and in commerce, generally speaking. But we advise regularly that a name is just a name, especially as you're getting started, unless you're in a kind of industry where the branding is the key aspect of whatever the product is. It's usually better to not fight too hard over keeping a name. If you're a startup business and you have a name that you like, but maybe there's another business that has it, it's usually easier to rebrand and do a relaunch under a new name. You can get a bunch of publicity from the swap, and you don't have to spend a huge amount on legal fees fighting some other company about a name that may not be proven in the marketplace yet. It's better to wait until you know that this name, this brand that you're growing is important and will be successful. At that point, you can start to consider those kinds of issues. Taxes are important. I'm not a tax lawyer. I'm impressed by people that are tax lawyers. Generally speaking, if you have employees in a state, you're going to want to consider registering for taxes in that state. Typically, if most of your employment issues can be dealt with by whoever your employee service provider is. ADP is a common one that a lot of people use. They'll help manage all of those pieces. Besides employment taxes, you've got to manage taxes on the income of the company. So if you're selling products in all 50 states, odds are you're going to have to pay taxes in all 50 states. It can be a pretty significant administrative burden. So it's also, unless there's a good business case for it, it often makes sense early stage to start in one or two states so that you don't have to deal with that amount of just administrative labor to manage your tax bills. And there's a difference between federal and state tax liability. So there's only one federal tax, fortunately. It's just extremely complicated. But there are 50 or more state and international tax regimes you're going to want to think about. If you're doing business internationally, you're going to have those taxes to worry about as well. There's also local taxes. So if you're doing business in Philadelphia, you might have a Philly tax to pay, a Pennsylvania tax to pay, and a US tax to pay. So that regime can get really complicated. You're going to want to work with accountants to answer most of your tax questions. Another key piece is on insurance and liability. If you've got an entity and you operate it in a professional manner, then that will shield you as an individual from a lot of liability. We recommend that, to the extent your bottom line can handle it, if you can afford to get insurance to cover slip and falls, standard kinds of liability that your business is expected to incur, that's a great way to make sure that, one small accident won't bankrupt your business and you can still keep operating. If you're starting to work with employees or interns or consultants, you will want to consult an attorney to make sure that you're treating those people properly. If you have someone who you're saying is an intern and you're not paying them, and then in 6 months they say, oh, you know what, I should have been an employee this whole time, they're going to come back and try to sue you to recover any wages they should have been paid during that time. So even if it's just minimum wage, if you take, I think it's $7.25 an hour now, and you multiply it by 40 hours a week and you multiply it by 6 months, suddenly it becomes a significant dollar amount. And if you've got 10 interns, all of a sudden you've got problems. Similar issues, you want to make sure if you've got consultants or independent contractors that you're managing them appropriately. IP protection issues, will vary based on your business. We talked about entity names before. Having a trademark name is an IP issue, important in some industries, not as important in others. If you're doing, building apps or doing coding, like that's another IP piece you're going to want to keep in mind as you're protecting that core piece of your business. If you're doing a more, pharmaceutical or medical research, that IP is really the core of that business. So you're going to want to make sure you take reasonable steps to protect it. And last not least, and in a non-exhaustive list here, every industry will have slightly different concerns. If you're in a business that works a lot with the government, there's a whole slew of laws you're going to want to think about and be concerned with to make sure that you are properly complying with those kinds of issues. If you're shipping internationally, there's all kinds of stuff you're going to want to think about. If you're producing internationally, you've got lots of issues there. If you're doing life sciences, you're going to want to keep an eye on the regulatory regime in that space. Generally, as you grow your business, these are things that you will grow into, but you want to have an eye on them as you're moving so that you can get a good idea of kind of where your risks are. I see there's a few questions. So Alana asks, if you're closing an LLC and the LLC still has debt, what is the best way to legally resolve it before dissolving the LLC? So if you're closing a business and it has debt in excess of assets, and there's no way that you're aware of, at least, to pay that debt, you could consider running the business through bankruptcy. That's a process where the debtors will haggle it out. I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer either, but generally speaking, it's a process where the debtors will haggle out who gets whatever the remaining assets are of the LLC. Alternatively, if you are on good terms with the debtors, you can just speak with them and try to reach an agreement where they say, we understand that the LLC is going to dissolve. I'll take 50% of whatever the debt was now, and we'll just move past it. Some debtors might be willing to do that. Depends on who you're dealing with. Typically, when you dissolve an LLC or any other entity, you are required to send notices out to known debtors or to known potential debtors, indicating that you're going to dissolve. That gives the debtors a chance to file claims and do things like that. So you want to be proactive if you can. Then Anthony has a question. A nonprofit established in Connecticut, so I'm going to presume it's a Connecticut nonprofit corporation, but it will work in California. Does the nonprofit pay California or Connecticut taxes? 2 offices, West Coast, East Coast. Okay, so if you're a business, okay, so it's a church. So if it's a church and it's got proper tax exempt status, it may not have to pay taxes at all, depending on, I'm not a Connecticut or a California lawyer, but there are likely significant exemptions from the tax regime based on religious nonprofit establishments. This is largely an accounting question. The accountant will have a better handle on exactly how mechanistically your business is going to pay taxes. If you're an employee, the employees are going to pay taxes wherever they live and earn the income. If you're a business and you're paying employment taxes, then again, I'm not certain about this. I would expect that you would need to pay taxes in those same locations as well. But this is more of an accountant, or if it's an employee-based issue, it's more of an ADP, that type of a service provider question. So that's kind of a brief rundown of a variety of concerns you might have as you're starting a business. Obviously, in my experience, almost everybody has similar questions, and they're almost all important. But the advantage to doing this, I do almost at least 1 a month, I'd say, between 5 and 10 a year. So doing this pretty often turns it into a routine for us, which is good because we know the answers to the questions that most people will ask, and we know how to efficiently manage the process so that we can keep the costs on our end, to the extent we can control them, we can keep them down as much as possible. But anyway, that's me for now. I'm here for questions. I think my email is in the first slide. If you guys want to email me, that's also fine.
And I don't think we mentioned that Spenser's an owl, Temple Owl, Beasley.
True.
I wanted to mention too, with regards to the name that you choose, like once you choose your name, make sure that you get all of the social media handles and all of the URLs and things, because people sort of speculate and will try to acquire those if they see somebody's formed an entity. So you want to make sure that you've gathered all those so you don't have to pay exorbitant fees to acquire them in the long run. But ask your question, feel free to unmute and shoot a question to Spenser or put it in the chat. We're here to help you guys out.